Hi, everyone. This is Aaron Henne, Artistic Director of Theater Dybbuk, and it's a pleasure to be with you again. For those who were with us last week, thanks for coming back, and everyone else, welcome. Before we dive in, just a few things. One is I want to acknowledge Theater Dybbuk's Marketing Director, Julie Lockhart, is here with me, and so if you comment or question throughout, you might hear her voice. She'll let me know those are coming in. Julie, say hi.
Hi there.
Great. I also want to say, for those who may not be aware, we are quarantined together. Our marketing director also happens to be my spouse. We are married, so this is all sanctioned. Two is that we're trying a new experiment this week, which is to use Zoom on Facebook Live. And so we'll see how it goes. If anything crashes, we've been having a little spotty Wi-Fi, so bear with us and thanks for your understanding in advance. Along those lines, I wanted to dive into this talk, which is to say that we during this time want to stay connected with one another and still keep creativity and artistic process and questions of how we engage still front and center, even while we're isolated. So thanks for being on the journey. Last week, for those who were with us, I talked about Theater Dybbuk's process and the way in which we create work. And I encourage, if you weren't with us, you can check that out on our Facebook page. So I'm not going to focus there today. Instead, I'm going to talk about the way in which we find particular in the universal and the conversation between that. And for those who don't know, Theater Dybbuk creates new theatrical work based on Jewish history and ritual for a diverse audience. So as you can hear, even in what we do, it is this conversation between particular entry point and universal communication. And one of the ways we really do that is we begin with a diverse ensemble of people. Theater Dybbuk is made up of people from a variety of walks of life, Jewish and not. And I think that is part of it, is although we are using Jewish history, we ourselves are engaging in a conversation with diverse perspectives that are reflective as best as can be of our world. Two is that the work we create over time, over 1 to 3 years per project, really starts with the universal and goes to the particular and comes back to the universal. So rather than being a line, it's a circle. And what I mean by that is often I and the team will begin with what's a question in our society, what's something on our minds that we're thinking about and concerned about. And then I will look for the unique entry point in Jewish history that allows us to deal with that question. And then that entry point allows us to have the conversation. So sometimes people assume that, oh, we begin with the Jewish and work our way out to the universal. I would actually say in some ways it's the other way around, or it's a conversation. So a few examples of that in our past work is our 2016 work, Exegog. I was curious in thinking about refugee and immigrant narratives. We were really on our minds was about the refugee crisis in the world, which of course is still ongoing, and what it means to be a stranger and what it means to be welcoming, and these questions of policy and politics around that. And so I started looking for the entry point to that from a Jewish perspective and found this remarkable work from the 2nd century before the Common Era that was the first recorded Jewish play. That was the Exodus, the biblical Exodus narrative, Moses, the Hebrews, the Israelites in Egypt, told in the style of Greek tragedy. And so we use that as an entry point to have a conversation about refugee and immigrant narratives. And so inside this original text, of which we only had fragments, we incorporated American narratives and modern day narratives of refugees and immigrants throughout the piece. And so we were in this conversation. Another work that operated along those lines was our 2018 piece called Lost Tribes. And at that moment, we were really asking questions first of identity in America especially, but in the world at large. And I was deeply curious about the parts of our identity that maybe we've forgotten, and if we could remember them, we could perhaps be more empathetic. And what I mean by that is, people who might now be part of the dominant culture or be viewed as part of the dominant culture who at one point were part of a marginalized group. And that narrative might be lost to ourselves. So what we did is we began with that question, and then we looked at the lost tribes of Israel, which, for those who don't know, is a whole history and mythologies and stories around the tribes of Israel that may have been lost to history and forgotten. And so we began with those in order to have a conversation about our world. And where the piece actually, after looking at that, eventually went to a lot about American history and immigration in America. And so those are two examples Before I continue, I just want to pause and say, if there are any comments or questions, things you want to know about process, what we mean by particular universal, the entry points I'm discussing, feel free to chime in. Also, just to say hi, you know, this is also about connecting, so please don't be shy. And I'll kind of keep chatting, but Julie will let me know if there's any questions arising. So this brings me to our current show that we are in development on, that currently is scheduled to open in August 2020 at the Philosophical Research Society in Los Feliz, and is being supported by the National Performance Network and in collaboration with LA Contemporary Exhibitions and the Hive at Leachtown Commons. These are all great partners. As with everyone, we don't know what's coming for the summer, so we are behaving as if, and we are still working together to develop the show in the hopes that August will still bring the opening, and we're doing everything we can to connect online and keep going. And what we started thinking about, and what I started thinking about a year or 2 years ago, was, here's the universal piece before I get to the particular, was questions for obvious reasons of false narratives, of the lies we're told and why we believe them or don't believe them, questions of where is truth in our society and what does that mean, and why are some narratives told about marginalized people. In particular, I'll be frank, you know, I was thinking about the migrant caravan that was really prominent in the news, and about the way that in some circles, narratives were being, false narratives of power were being ascribed to those people who were in need and making their way to this country and elsewhere. And what I mean is false narratives, you know, ascribing that they want to change our way of life, or that secretly there's terrorism, you know. And I thought, why is there this need to ascribe false narratives of power of some kind to those who are marginalized, hurting, oppressed, etc.? What is the purpose of that from political and social perspectives? And I thought, all right, how do we enter that? What's the Jewish way of entering? What's the point in history or the narrative? And it became really obvious that that point of history or narrative was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And for those who don't know, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is an anti-Semitic, fraudulent, fake text that claims to be the protocols or guidelines or minutes of meetings, or a series of meetings of a kind of cabal of powerful Jews and their plans to take over or rule the world through economic, social, and political means. And I thought, wow, this text, which has been around roughly 120 years, give or take, has had unfortunate power. And even though it has been proven false again and again, people still utilize it as proof of Jewish power. And I thought, wow, this text is kind of a great container for having this conversation, yes, about the particularities of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, but also about questions of how we treat people in the world and why we tell and believe false narratives about them. So one, again, before I go on at all, I just want to say that's what I'm talking about. We started with the big, came to the particular, and moving back out to the big, and we're hoping that we can really encourage multifaceted conversation, both about anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism and about the world at large. And I'll give you one or two examples in history from the protocols of how it's both particular and universal. So there was debate about when they were written and who exactly wrote them and for what purposes. But we do know that they were likely created in the late 1800s, early 1900s for the purpose of propaganda in Russia. And at that time in Russia, of course, we were in a time of great social change. Industrialization had come to that area of the world a little later than some other areas, so there was big upheaval. And connected to that upheaval, we were seeing this all-powerful monarchy, the Tsar, and that family. Questions of their power were starting to come up. People were starting to consider revolt. And so, of course, what happens in a moment of great uncertainty, where power is being upended, is a narrative is created for likely political purposes to demonize an already marginalized group, a group that has already seen the Jews as separate from the greater society, and to kind of pull the focus from bigger concerns to these other concerns. And I think if we think about today, that's not just a story of Jews in Russia, that's a story of, what's going on in our own world, where the world is changing rapidly, structures are changing, the way we communicate is changing, and who do we choose to put our focus and blame on and why in that moment. Another example that is remarkable in the protocol's history that we're going to be exploring in the piece is one of the main first publishers. It was published a few different times in ways early in its original days. It was a gentleman named Sergei Nilus. And if you track Nilus over the period of about 20 years, he changes his story about who created the protocols and in what setting. I think at first he says it's a Jewish Masonic conspiracy, which for those who don't know was a whole thing going on at that time, Jewish Masonic conspiracy. Then at one point years later, he says, oh, no, it wasn't the Jewish Masonic conspiracy, it was the World Zionist Congress and the Jews who were gathering to consider how a state of Israel might happen, and they secretly created this document. And then years later, he says, no, it's connected to Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution. So you can track, literally through one person, the way in which the political concerns of the moment are being used in order to evolve a story. And again, as we think about the universal and we think about in our own moment what stories are evolving both slowly and rapidly in order to meet the moment and in order to keep power. So I just want to pause there for a second because I just gave you a ton of information about history, about particular and universal in the conversation we're having. Any questions or comments arising, Julie, as of yet?
Not really.
Okay.
People just saying hi.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. And, I'll also pause to say, on this thread, we may have audience members, I have a hunch some friends and family might be there, as well as creators and artists, and some of Theater Dybic's associate artists and teaching artists may be joining us as well. And I think that as you think about your own work, asking the question of how what is particular to me is also universal to the world, and how are we having this conversation? And sometimes people ask, if what you're interested in is the world at large, why are you beginning from a Jewish perspective? So before I go into more protocols, I'll address that. One is because I come from Jewish history, that is my entry point. This is a world of intersecting narratives. And I think we all, if we can perhaps acknowledge that we come from particular perspectives and investigate them, we might have a world that actually has a little more empathy and peace because these different narratives understand that they're talking to one another. Two is, look, the Jewish history is, I won't say the history of the whole world because that would be, an overstatement possibly, but I will say that as a diaspora people for thousands of years, it is a history that intersects with and is parallel with and can comment on a variety of things in our world. So I also think it's a powerful entry point for that reason. And it can't be separated from world history, which is why it is both particular and universal. A few other protocol things. So right now, the other thing going on in the piece as we are in development is we're discovering that not only are we going to deal with the protocols, but we will probably go back further into some other history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Because of course, no narrative exists in a single moment. It exists in conversation with all the narratives that came before. And so one or two examples of this that I think are powerful, again, in this conversation between particular and universal is, some of you may be familiar with the really abhorrent narrative of the blood libel, which in Jewish history, at times it has been claimed, of course, completely false, that Jews have, the blood libel is a narrative that says that Jews have killed Christians and used the blood in Jewish ritual. And I'm bringing this up in the piece because, of course, the protocols are a container for all the other narratives that led to it. So the blood libel, putting aside the really ancient version of how it came up, really arose around the 1100s. And it began really with a story of a boy in a village in England being killed, and then a narrative being created that it was the Jews. And yes, I see a question.
Yeah, Leslie's wanting to have a little more information, see if you can comment as to why when a libel has been proved to be a libel, the belief still exists, not just in the protocols, but every blood libel against any group or religion.
Great.
So why do those things persist?
So there's this question of why do these narratives persist? So I will sort of finish telling about the blood libel, then address that because it's interrelated. So when the blood libel was sort of born in our modern context, a boy in a village in England was killed, and a narrative got created that it had to do with the Jewish ritual of crucifixion and using his blood. And this kind of narrative caught fire, and then a variety of different places started saying this happened. And Leslie, this will partly address your question, but not fully. Why? Well, there were political considerations going on at the moment, which I can go into, but I'm going to talk about the economic ones. This was a time in history when a lot of villages and towns were having local saints, martyred saints. And if they had a martyred saint, they could become a place that pilgrims would come. And what do pilgrims bring with them? Commerce, right? They are giving money to the church. They are perhaps spending their wealth and bartering and buying in the village or town. So one of the particular universal conversations is thinking about how, yes, in this particular story, a Jewish narrative against Jews is being used for economic and power gains. And the way in which that can catch fire, right? It is easier to blame or use the other for your own economic purposes, right? If we think even in our modern context, some of the people who are sometimes demonized are the very people that our society relies on for some kinds of work and economic stability. So one, Leslie, regarding your question, why does the narrative stick around even when it's been proven false? I think one is that when one's power and economic interests are at stake, I'm not a psychologist, but I feel like the brain goes, I'm worried about these things. This is what's important to me. And so that's where my focus is. Two, look, I think we all do this, right? Where we have a bias towards the things we want to believe to make us feel safe and secure in our world. And so even when proven false, we may be reluctant to accept that proof. I mean, think about right now, even on our Facebook pages, right? That people are posting all sorts of things that often are not true, but align with their belief system politically or otherwise. And we have all sorts of ways to very quickly check this. We have Snopes, we have other ways to fact check, and yet people don't always because they want to believe this worldview, this thing that helps them. Two, look, and this is part of my job as a playwright, is to get curious about human behavior and to make some decisions about it, even if, scientifically they may or may not be supported, but just my observations as an artist, is also that it is easier to look outward than to look within, right? Once I have a narrative that allows me to blame the other, it means I can spend less time in here wondering what's going on or why I'm in the position I'm in, or asking, frankly, larger structural questions. That's the other thing. If I can blame the other, I don't have to ask, how do we upend the whole system that doesn't work? Because it's their fault. That's the other thing about the blood libel. At the time in English history, there was a conflict going on between the Normans and the Saxons and who had power. And there's also some evidence that perhaps this blood libel was a way for the people who might have trouble with their rulers to deal with their anxiety. In other words, they can't actually upend the royals and the rulers, but what they can do is blame some of the other people in their village. So I also think that's why when we feel powerless, we try and find power where we can. I hope that perspective is interesting and helpful. Before I offer another thought, Julie, any other questions or comments?
Nope, I think we're good to finalize your thoughts.
Great. So the last thing I will offer is that the piece right now, we are investigating vaudeville actually as a way of entering the work. One is because what does an absurd narrative deserve? It deserves absurdity. It deserves something that is entertaining and ridiculous and satirical and over the top, because these false narratives are. That is what they are. And so we want the form to follow the function. But two, vaudeville, and this will be where I'll leave questions of particularity and universality, vaudeville was this profoundly immigrant-related form that often performers in vaudeville were coming from cultural perspectives that were at the time not the dominant ones. And one of the things that often would happen in vaudeville is that the performers themselves would use the stereotypes about their people and perform those stereotypes. So Jewish performers would sometimes do something called Jew face, for example, where they would actually do all the over-the-top things that are sometimes associated with some Jewish stereotypes. And other performers, Irish, Italian, and so on, would do the same. So vaudeville becomes a perfect conversation to have a discussion, yes, about the particularly Jewish entry point to this, but also about the ways people of all sorts come together and have to deal with the assumptions about who they are, and do they embrace them? Do they hit back against them? Do they actually use them in order to become more accepted? Or do they try and upend them? And so we're going to be asking those questions in the piece as well. Couple things before we close out. First of all, thank you for joining me today again. We are right now as a company investigating how we continue these. Do these talks become weekly? Do we include other content online from our company? So we'll be keeping you informed of that as we try to stay engaged in this moment. Please feel free to go to our website, www.theaterdivic.org, or come here to our Facebook page for updates. You can sign up for our newsletter on the website as well. And thank you so much for spending the time. And I really do hope that you and yours stay safe and healthy at this moment. Thanks.